Hello, everyone. This is Mehmet from Fredsetsana. And today I'm alone as host. Eric is away in Cuba with his communist friends doing communist things. He'll be back in a couple of weeks and then we'll talk about his adventures there as well. But today it's just me as your host, and I'm super happy to welcome Professor Adnan Husain to our show. Welcome.
Welcome
Assalamu
to you.
alaikum.
Thank you. Wa alaikum salam. It's great to be on. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for joining. This is the third time we're having a conversation, you and I.
That's
Uh,
right. Once on your a previous program of yours, and then
exactly.
on my show when it was in my new show when it was in its infancy, we had a great conversation. So I'm glad that we're finding some regular opportunities
Yeah,
for some discussion.
all three times are my honor. Actually, it's been. I'm really honored to call you a teacher, a friend, a comrade. So thanks again for joining us.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you again, Mehmet.
So, i- our topic today is Islamophobia as a pillar for the Western civilization. But could you introduce yourself first so that people understand why you are the person to talk about this?
Sure. There are maybe many people who could talk about different components of this question of Islamophobia and why it's so central to the political and cultural and social order of the West. But I think I have a particular approach that comes from being a historian, and a historian of a particular kind. I work on the cross-cultural and interreligious histories of the medieval Mediterranean world. So the interactions between um, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, mostly from the period of the start of the Crusader era, 11th century, to the 14th or 15th centuries, is what I kind of teach. And I came upon that set of interests because I was interested in religion and society. I was myself somebody who was born and raised in the United States to two Muslim immigrants, one from, uh, yeah, I guess the short story is Turkey, but like so many people who are Turks, they're really from somewhere else or have a different kind of identity, but they've been amalgamated into Turkishness, you know, by hook or by crook, sometimes by crook. Um, and on the other side, South Asian from my father's side. And so I had a broadly Islamic kind of background as a young Muslim. And because my parents came from very different cultural ends of the kind of central Islamic lands, you might say. What they had in common was not their ethnicity, culture, or language, but it was Islam. So that was the root and foundation of our family's identity as a mixed kind of culture. Um, and so I was always interested in the kind of broader identity of Muslimness. Um, and of course, how that related um, to what it meant to be growing up in the United States, in America, and how to reconcile these things. So, because I was interested in religion and I was interested both in the Islamic world and in the sort of heritage and culture of Western societies, I looked to the medieval period as a place where one could kind of think about these kinds of questions of deeper identities and intersections and the way in which what was often called Islam and the West, kind of related to one another. And I started these interests well before, the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was maybe happening around the time that I was an undergraduate student. And when I was in graduate school during the course of the 1990s studying history, it seemed like it was very possible to think about integrating these into a kind of common sort of Mediterranean history rather than thinking of Islam and the West as necessarily in opposition. But then somebody like Samuel Huntington, kind of reframed this situation in the post-Cold War to try and hijack history, you might say, to a theory about civilizational conflict, where for him, the difference between the West and the world of Islam was foundational and fundamental. And you could say, in a way, that it was the nightmare proposition in his Western imagination about the clash of civilizations, that the Islamic world might somehow um, make an alliance with the other great rival of a different Eastern civilization, that of China, right? So East Asian society and culture. So his great sort of fear was a geopolitical world in which Islam and China, would come together as opponents, of the West. So this was the kind of geopolitical imagination and international relations that started to be developed as not an ideological question about systems of political economy or of political organization, democracy and capitalism supposedly on one side, and kind of collective communism, on the other. That no longer were we in an ideological world, so we had to look to these deeper kind of roots of cultural difference in these units he called civilizations. And while I think this is, a pretty simplistic and foolish way to actually organize global history and contemporary geopolitical relations, what is true is that this idea of a division is something that is pretty foundational to Western political and cultural thinking for a long period of time. And this is not some brilliant insight on my part. I mean, it's something that Edward Said so brilliantly discussed in Orientalism, about the role of the East as a product and a projection of a forming Western imagination. And that, in fact, actually, the identity of the West really couldn't have formed the way it did and taken the shape that it did without this dichotomous kind of inimical relation with an other, a near other, an other that it was familiar with, that it encountered in the Mediterranean world. And so, what turned into, or what started perhaps as a optimistic hope to think histories of interreligious and cross-cultural unity, and thinking about the Mediterranean itself as a historical unit, especially after 9/11, became reorganized in much of Western political and historical thinking along the lines of the influential thesis by Samuel Huntington on the clash of civilizations. And we saw such an immense revival of an Islamophobic worldview that expressed itself in the geopolitical terms of the global war on terror. But because I'm a medievalist, a- and a medieval Mediterranean historian, both of of medieval Europe and of the Islamic world, um, I had a sense that there were some components um, of the story of Islamophobia that needed to be taken back to an earlier period, not because Samuel Huntington himself was correct in his thesis, because it could have been otherwise, but because Samuel Huntington's thesis was really just a rearticulation of a long-standing construction of Western political, religious, and cultural thought that emerged, in my view, um, from early encounters with Islam, took more, greater kind of coherence and shape during the era of the Crusades, and then patterned early modern imperial relations that helped form the modern world in the context of Europe's colonial and imperial projects of the 18th century to the modern world. And so it was not possible to just see um, this kind of turn towards Islamophobia as a central pillar of Western political imagination and cultural identity, as simply, a replacement, a new construct and product of the need for a new Cold War enemy. It may indeed have, been something like a useful turn, but it was, one that had, deeper roots um, than just the conjunctures of 1990s, post Cold War politics, or the post 9/11 world order. Those were actually, it seems to me, um, reassertions of a much older paradigm, which, in my sense, really helps explain why Islamophobia is such an important phenomenon to study, to really understand the politics of the contemporary West.
Thank you for that introduction. I mean, so when people talk about Islamophobia these days, it's generally like part of this identity politics kind of framework, uh, which I mean has its use when it touches people's daily lives. I'm not gonna downplay that. It's daily racism at the same time, so
Yeah.
um, there is definitely value of talking about it in that sense as well. But I think what you do and what I want people to understand in this episode is that this is actually a structural question. Uh, that Islam was this and Muslims was this foundational enemy in the beginning of what became the West. Uh, so what do you think is Islamophobia, and when did it start according to you, specifically? And there's a connected question here, like someone a listener, a follower has pointed out, like, why is it called phobia? I mean, like, we don't say Semitophobia. It's
Hmm.
actually anti-Semitism, and it's quite clear that it means like being against a certain group, not being afraid of a certain group.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in the earlier periods of scholarship around the question of Islamophobia, when definitions and terms were being debated and discussed, some groups coined or picked up on an earlier coinage of this term, Islamophobia, that is parallel to xenophobia, to homophobia, right? Where um, it isn't just fear of strangers, right? That's not what xenophobia alone means. And phobias, if we look at the kind of broader senses of the word and the use of the word, um, they can be kind of fears, but they are also kind of conjoined somehow with disgust and hatred, right? So they are all kind of tapping into some deep emotional revulsion and rejection of some form of difference. It could have been anti-Muslim bigotry. It could have been, anti-Muslim racism. There are a lot of ways in which, we could define or come up with the nomenclature to accurately reflect some component of the phenomenon that we're interested in here. But for me, what's most important is less the term and how you would narrowly define it, and debating fine distinctions about which kind of vocabulary to use, than it is the kind of conceptual question of how Islam and Muslims, and we could say Muslimness, because people who are mistaken for Muslims are often treated with the same hatred and bigotry. So, of course, everyone should be quite familiar with the fact that the first violent attacks upon a religious community and a religious place of worship in the United States after 9/11 was a Sikh temple, right? Because Sikhs were mistaken for Muslims. And so, what this points out is that it's a kind of form of racism that has particular features in directing against Muslimness and perceived Muslim identity, right? So, um, it's a rather capacious kind of concept that has continuities with uh, xenophobia and racism, except that there is a much more continuous history associated with anti-Muslimness or Islamophobia. So for me, it's that historical kind of question that Islam and Muslims represented for the European and Western imagination as a whole some kind of rival system, a rival cultural, religious, ethnic system that was both, kind of cultural and ideological in the sense that there was a religious doctrines and creeds. It was obviously a distinct religious community with many overlapping and compatible beliefs, but many differences, right, at the level of what we would think of as religion and theology. But more kind of significantly and importantly is that it was based in a kind of um, politics and in polities, that there were organized political units that represented the way in which a religious and cultural system, could be lived out and expressed in kind of political terms. And so that, it seems to me, is the fact that it was a kind of counterpoint and a rival to developing ideas of Christendom, which is something more than um, just a concept of where there are Christians. It's a sense of Christian political society, right? That that there's some kind of formation that is a cultural, political, and religious system collectively that expresses itself in territoriality, and that so that Christendom is the lands that are, and especially Latin Christendom in particular, are the lands where political society is established, historically speaking, under the legitimating auspices of the Pope as kind of titular head of Christian society, even if, of course, um, actual political power would devolve to local kings and lords and warlords and so on. What legitimated them as part of Christendom was that they had the Catholic religion, and they recognized that their political and religious order was under the auspices of recognizing the Pope as kind of supreme guarantor of the legitimacy of their political units, right, and their the nature of their societies and so forth. And Islam seemed very similar, uniquely so, in that once they discover that Islam is a religion, and that Islamdom, if you want to put it in those terms, or Islamicate societies, um, are parallel in some ways, that they are a religious community that has expression in particular form of political society and culture, that was seen as a major rivalry, an enemy, in which Christendom had to compete for universalist hegemony. And of course, these competitions, happened, with Rome, Byzantium, what's called Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, but really, actually, that's not a good way of really framing it. The people themselves, at least the political elites, referred to themselves as Romans, and so it's the Eastern Roman Empire. Um, were rivals and, had kind of border conflicts with the Umayyad and Abbasid empires. But then later, during the era of the Crusades in particular, as Latin Christendom is forming itself and its identity and changing the relationships between, political rulers and, the relationship between religious and political authority and so forth, and creating a kind of concept of itself as Latin Christendom, it is also at the same time engaged in external wars, the Crusades, with the Islamic world, with the
Can I
Muslim.
can I jump in there? So you mentioned Christendom, and then you mentioned Latin Christendom.
Yeah.
Sort of what distinguishes them? And so, if I understood you correctly, Christendom did exist uh, before this animosity began, uh,
Well, yeah. I mean,
or
what
formed.
existed was a Christian empire. Right. So Rome was a Christian empire. Once Constantine and his successors essentially adopt Christianity as the religion of the ruling, class of the empire, and decide that it should be imposed upon, its subjects. You have something like a kind of Christendom that emerges, what I would call kind of Christian confessional empire. That is confessional form of religion, monotheistic with doctrine, a set of scriptures, a kind of religious elite that interprets those scriptures for the rest of society, that believes that it has exclusive access to the right path to fulfill God's will, and that you can't, have more than one kind of such alliance. You can't be a Christian Muslim or a Christian Jew, or, you might have been in the early periods, like you might have been a Jew who followed Christ, and you have these kind of ambiguities, but at a certain point, the confessional religion comes to distinguish itself and its boundaries by establishing its canon, its doctrines, holding these councils to establish what is orthodox, religious belief. And then this kind of form of religion that is exclusive, that is total, that is monotheistic, is then conjoined with political empire. So confessional religion and empire as mutually reinforcing kind of modes of organizing political, cultural, religious life, uh, is something that emerges as a result of the adoption of Christianity, by the Roman Empire. And so you have confessional confessional empires, Christian confessional empires, and that's essentially what you could call a kind of Christendom. However, in the Latin West, that is not in the lands where Greek language was the predominant, form of, literature and administration and culture in, the western parts of the former Roman Empire. You have new formations that emerge from these Germanic tribal societies that adopt Christianity and, try and resurrect and resuscitate some form of political order, where Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Frankish king, um, is crowned Holy Roman Emperor, right? Um, and so you have some kind of formation that is established that distinguishes it from the Eastern Roman Empire, and where Latin language is the lingua franca, is the language of administration, is the church language, is the liturgical language, and so we would distinguish between come kind of broader kind of concept of Christendom as the community of all Christians, um, particularly those who have independent political society, political power, some kind of sovereignty, religious sovereignty, political sovereignty, and Latin Christendom, which is a precursor, we could say, is a precursor to Europe, Western Europe, right, and the West. So that's how I would distinguish it, because even though, of course, you have a Christian confessional empire under the Eastern Romans, and a self-conscious kind of Christian society and culture, um, it is organized in ways that are rather different, culturally and politically and even religiously, than what we come to be aware of in the Latin world, in Latin Christendom. It is much more, I would characterize it as much more a Mediterranean kind of, you know, polity, that is diverse, cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, can tolerate and accommodate um, religious others in a way as subordinates, but not, um, as objects of um, persecution in the sort of genocidal way that starts to emerge in the Latin West. And I would say, that the early Middle Ages, before the era of the Crusades, that there are, differences, but across the Mediterranean world as a whole, there are a lot of continuities, and there are similar patterns of incorporation and subordination of religious minorities. For example, we're not talking about a world of, religious equality or of political citizenship. Everybody is a subject to some kind of warlord or, dynastic kings and so forth. So we're not talking about a kind of modern political society. It's obviously going to be organized in different terms, but within those limits and within those terms, there are more or less accommodating, methods of incorporating religious others, ethnic others, and so forth. And you know that changes and transforms even in the West, I would argue. By the 11th, 12th, 13th century, some different process is underway where religious difference, is treated in new ways and is a new problem, that is a threat to the integrity of Christian society, of Christendom. And it happens that, you know, the concept of Christendom, as it's deployed and territorialized in the Latin West, is happening roughly at the same time, it seems, as the launching of the Crusades, and that there's some kind of intimate relationship between these two things. And what we have to understand about those processes, both externally, i.e., war outside, and persecution within, is that religious others are turned into enemies, enemies within and enemies without, and very oftentimes they are allied with one another in the paranoid political imagination and fears of, of that society. And that's what I would say is when you may have hostility to Jews, you may have hostility to Saracens as they're known, but they're not a kind of existential and ontological kind of social and political problem in the same way, until you have the attempts at forming Latin Christendom and perceiving that it is very, how to put it, very vulnerable, to being undermined by heretics, by internal religious others like Jews and heretics, as well as religious and cultural others outside, especially those that are, ruling over Christians, because, for hundreds of years, the vast majority of, the populations of North Africa, Egypt, of the Levant, what is today Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, southern Turkey, southern Anatolia. They were all, pretty much majority Christians. I mean, there were Jews and there were many varieties of Christians, and they didn't always get along and agree with one another. But what we're, you know, considering is that, there was, large scale Christian society. And so after the, Arab and Muslim, and it's not always clear early on what's most predominant in terms of organizing, the nature of this political class and the nature of the military. But after the conquests that take place, Muslims are, ruling, Arabs, Muslims are ruling, you know, majority Christian society, and it takes hundreds of years of slow conversion, both of linguistic change as well as religious change, for it to become, a majority Muslim society, first in the major cities and garrison towns that are established, and then over time, over many centuries, finally into the countryside. And so this was seen also as a kind of political problem. The Crusades, for example, were justified in a variety of ways, but one of the ways in which it was um, justified or rationalized or explained in terms of its motivations was loving, you know, um, one's neighbors, and loving one's co-religionists, and having to intervene essentially, because there were Christians who were subordinate, living under Muslim sovereignty, which was something that was seen as an impossibly horrible situation, for a Christian of the Latin West to be subordinated to pagan, they often thought of Muslims as pagans, but then increasingly they came to understood, some other rival religious system ruling over and expressing religious sovereignty over what was claimed as Christian holy places in the Holy Land. I mean, nobody was talking about the Holy Land. They talked about Jerusalem, but they talked about Jerusalem both as an earthly and a heavenly kind of experience, and privileged the heavenly over this earthly. I mean, that's the whole point of Christ as Messiah, is that, they've moved away from the territorial, earthly idea of kings and sovereigns over, reconstituting royal sovereignty, the Jewish Messiah, being the anointed one, i.e., anointed means, kind of the oils put on, which is part of how you make a king, is you anoint them. So the anointed one coming and reestablishing political rule over this territory, that was kind of rejected by early Christians, where the heavenly Jerusalem was much more significant or important. But at some point, and particularly during the era of the Crusades, there is manufactured more of a kind of territorial kind of necessity of having religious sovereignty in the so-called Holy Land, which is now being talked about as a holy land, and not just, a city of Jerusalem that is a earthly city versus a heavenly city, a spiritual kind of city or a spiritual experience. So that's something that starts to change during this period. And I would argue that's when really you have Islamophobia. Like I said, you may have had anti-Jewish sentiment, you may have had and also that's what I would argue, is you start to have something like proto anti-Semitism. And I would argue that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, the roots of those phenomenon, we're using modern kind of characterizations, but at least the roots of something transforming into a different kind of hatred and rivalry, and a sense of threat of the enemy, that this is an enemy to be dealt with. Otherwise, it will be an existential threat, undermining the very fabric and integrity of Christian society. That is something that emerges here in this 12th and 13th century period, in the auspices of forging an idea of Latin Christendom and wars, these external wars of crusades that are accompanied by these pogroms, these massacres, these wars again, and burnings of the heretics. Like, this is all kind of happening together at approximately the same time. And I would argue these are interrelated phenomenon, and that it is the galvanizing component of organizing society for these wars, and the subsequent need to kind of reform and purify within, so that you can be successful in these wars against this rival community outside, i.e., the kind of very roots of Islamophobia, are absolutely crucial to the self-definition and the historical processes that come to distinguish the Latin West, Latin Christendom, i.e., eventually Europe, from other world regions, at the time, that are part of the Mediterranean world, had shared kind of patterns of inclusion and exclusion, broadly speaking, with some differences and so forth. But that this is something that when they say, oh, the West is unique, Europe has this unique history, yes, I mean, it isn't just, that because they happen to invent so many wonderful scientific things and then invented freedom and democracy. Yeah, they also invented a certain kind of religious persecution, genocide, ethnic cleansing, that led to colonialism and colonial violence, settler colonial violence around the world. See, right? So, yes, it does have its unique history, that it's went along a path that was different in its development, in which Islamophobia, the wars against Islam as an enemy, as a kind of constitutional enemy, was important in its development and in its self identity.
Thank you. That was an amazing stream of consciousness. Uh, so I think it was very interesting to hear that Latin Christendom was more or less what the West is, sort of in its foundations. That was, to summarize what I understood from it. That was, I think, very interesting. Um, and you mentioned uh, when you mentioned internal enemies uh, for Latin Christendom at the time, you mentioned heretics, which I
Hmm.
understand as internal enemies as well, but also mentioned Jews as internal enemies.
Yeah.
Why? Like, why are Jews internal?
Well, I mean, they were part of Christian society. Early church father Saint Augustine, author of the Confession, City of God, on Christian doctrine. Very important figure, maybe one of the most important Christian thinkers. Until Thomas Aquinas, or if you want to put it in these kinds of, almost pop culturally terms, like he's, important until, you get some other figure of similar influence on the culture intellectually. So he developed a kind of doctrine that rationalized the place of Jews in Christian society and in the world, in fact, because obviously there was this sense that, well, this age of the era of the so-called Old Testament is over. Hebrew Bible has been eclipsed. We still need to read it and to interpret it, but not for the literal meaning that had been carried by the Jews preserving their scripture, but actually for its spiritual and prophetic announcement of the coming of Christ, right? That's what it was valuable for. And that the, kingdom of heaven had arrived, the Messiah had arrived, but it wasn't in the form of the literal kind of worldly power, but in fact, it was this kind of spiritual kingdom of heaven that had arrived, and the Messiah was a spiritual figure that achieved salvation, right? So there was this kind of historical, theological view about what Christianity was and meant in kind of a global salvation history that eclipsed or superseded the Jewish religion and the era of the Jews and Jewish interpretation, and that this was symbolized by what was regarded by Christian thinkers, patristics, and church fathers and beyond, um, as a very important and interesting historical coincidence that they forged, that um, Christ, sort of, Jesus's era, and the kind of destruction of the Jewish temple were not that far apart, and so the destruction essentially of the Jewish kingdoms and the dispersal of the Jews was coincident in their sort of view with the emergence of this new age of salvation in the Christian era. And as a result, there had to be some kind of theology of history to explain the continued persistence of Jews in the world, not in the form of a Jewish kingdom and a polity and a people established in the Near East, but now dispersed throughout the world. And Augustine came up with this explanation and understanding that they should be tolerated, they should be subordinate and subservient to Christians, but they actually served a very fruitful and important role in preserving as witnesses the text of the Bible in its original Hebrew form that was itself uh, clearly, announcing the coming of Christianity and of Christian doctrine and so forth. They themselves couldn't see it. They were prevented from seeing it, but they did this amazing and wonderful and necessary service of proving for the world that you couldn't make up this kind of spiritual allegorical reading. The Christians hadn't invented these previous texts, but anybody who came to them could see the truth of Christianity, through them. And so they were to be tolerated, in Christian society. They served a kind of purpose. So they could be seen as a subordinate religious other that had a place in Christian society. What I, would, ask people to think about is what a lot of scholars who study the place of Jews in medieval Europe um, have pointed out, which is that this doctrine, so somebody like Jeremy Cohen's work in several different books, argues that what happened in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries in particular is an erosion of this Augustinian doctrine that accommodated Jews within Christian society, but started to turn them into a kind of heresy almost, that they were like heretics in that they were departing from this kind of caricature as Old Testament figures. And as there is a recognition and a discovery that rabbinic Judaism, kind of has developed along a different sort of path, and they are not just these, living embodiments and bearers of like the Hebrew, Old Testament in Christian terms, law, but they've actually had a continuing extra scriptural tradition. Um, that undermines their status in some ways, of fulfilling Augustine's kind of role for them, and that they are, contemporary Jews are essentially heretics of the biblical Jews that they need to be for Christian purposes. And you start to have this breaking down. There are many other kind of social and political factors one could also look at. But I would argue one thing that happens is that they are made into internal enemies and are often thought of as a carnal religion, a carnal heresy, like the Saracens, and that they are, i.e., the Muslims, and that they are natural allies of the Muslims, and then in fact, actually, um, they are a potential fifth column, So what happens is that every single one of these major crusade mobilizations ends up also involving anti-Jewish violence, massacres, pogroms. The first, well, you would say one of the first really big waves across a large territory. There might have been local kind of cases where communities in conflict might develop, and this kind of persecuted minority might do something that upset a Christian lord or a group, and there might be some violence that would happen. But these were local conditions and local situations that developed. um, what happens with the First Crusade is widespread anti-Jewish violence across the Rhineland. It's very famous, but in parts of France, into Eastern Europe, along the pathway of the Crusaders. That where they went on the First Crusade, they were accompanied certain groups, you know, uh, 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 you know, um, certain groups that went on crusade um, and traveled through from Western Europe into Eastern Europe, committed these kinds of atrocities, of massacres of Jews over the course of their travels. And this was so widespread that it was a unique kind of phenomenon, and suggests in some way that Jews and Muslims were both um, kind of characterized as enemies of Christ, and that they shared that. And in some sense, there's an association between the two that became dangerously violent for Jews within Christian society and undermined their place and position, in it. I should say, however, that when I characterized in kind of broad sort of brushstrokes that the Muslims are this external political and military sort of and religious territorial kind of rival and threat, the object of Crusader mobilization, it's important to point out that there are many Muslims who are internal to Latin Christian society during this era as well. There are, of course, those in Spain who are conquered um, by the Aragonese and Castilian monarchs. Um, there are the peoples of the Balearic Islands. Now people go to Ibiza and Mallorca and so on for vacation, and they have no idea of the history of these places that were mixed societies, and that for hundreds of years they were populated by a Muslim peasantry. And in the 13th century, late 13th century, for example, Minorca was absolutely ethnically cleansed. The people were genocidally eliminated. The men were slaughtered, and after conquest, the men were slaughtered, and the women and children sold into slavery, and the territory appropriated by new settlers um, from the Iberian Peninsula. And because of the nature of the soil, um, uh, you know, uh, it was very difficult for the settler colonial community to actually make it productive agriculturally, because they'd wiped out the people who had forged, you know, indigenous, you could say, ways of living on the land and making it productive, and they lost those techniques because they eliminated this population. um, and similar sorts of things started to happen on the Iberian Peninsula. In the Kingdom of Valencia, they were a little bit more intelligent. They wanted to kind of appropriate the land. They made the city of Valencia a Christian only city, and forbade Jews and Muslims from spending you know uh, you know they had to leave the city, right? They couldn't like reside overnight and stay in the city, except in certain kind of locations for purpose of trade and so on, but they couldn't be residents of the city. Whereas the rest of the kind of countryside, which was very productive agriculture, very famous even to contemporary times, of the Valencia oranges, and the groves that were all developed by very complex irrigation systems. And it was impossible to kind of really replace the population quickly and maintain the productivity of the land. So for a hundred or several hundred years, actually until the 16th century, the countryside of Valencia was majority Muslim. Okay, even after conquest in the 13th century, because they couldn't replace this valuable peasantry and population that was capable of managing, the complex and maintaining the complex, system of water distribution and irrigation that allowed Valencia to be such a fertile and productive agricultural, breadbasket and place for all the fruits and vegetables and so on. So what we have is this kind of process where Muslims, we would forget these histories because Muslims have been eliminated from these spaces, from Sicily, where they were there for hundreds of years. uh, it's only under Frederick II in the early 13th century that the uh, remaining Muslim population, after a couple hundred years of Norman conquest and rule, that initially was much more kind of tolerant and really required and absolutely depended on the Greek, the Jewish, and the Muslim populations. Again, a very important peasant and productive peasant population. But in the southwestern part of the island, that had remained predominantly Arab and Muslim for a long period of, well, Berber and Muslim, there was a mixed population. Um, for a long period of time since the 11th century, mid 11th century, when the Normans had conquered, um, parts of Sicily. Uh, they continued to persist into the 13th century as like majority of the population in that part of Sicily. They rose up in rebellion at a certain point against Frederick II, and his solution to this kind of problem of managing and controlling these populations. That, and we should point out, if you ever look at a map, the southwestern part is close to the North African coast, right? So it's much more in communication, and you could have trade, and you could have people kind of circulating and so on. As a result, he decided to just move this population. After he suppressed the revolt, he just moved this population and set up a city in Apulia in central Italy. Okay, that was a Muslim kind of a Muslim city, and he used those people as his kind of shock troops in his wars against the Pope. Okay, because they were rivals for control over Italy. And so he turned this population that had been a rebellious population in Sicily, now became a dependent and loyal population to him, in central Italy. And we don't hear these stories in history, so we think that the Muslims, when they have come to Europe in post-war migration, is just some kind of new phenomenon, and that there is no history and kind of claims of having been part of what we now think of as Europe: Spain, Sicily, um, Balearic Islands, and so forth. And there's other examples one could give. Even there was a small for about a century or so, there was an emirate of Bari, on the eastern side of the Italian peninsula. So, like, these are all kind of footnotes of European history that are completely forgotten. This idea that Muslims are just newcomers coming from as foreigners from afar, and have no kind of connection or basis. Well, it's because they were genocided. They were either killed, enslaved, or forcibly converted, right? And so their history, their identity was erased. So we shouldn't forget that this internal external is only a schematic that I'm mentioning. There were lots of Muslims inside what we would think of as Latin Christendom, ruled by Latin Catholic, sovereigns for centuries, under, in Europe. And that, in fact, actually, when we have these regulations about separating populations and distinguishing religious communities from one another, and insisting, for example, that distinctive garb and clothing be worn so that religious others could be identified, this is often only thought about in the context of Jews in Iberia. And it then recalls to us the parallel of what happened during the Nazi era, where Jews had to wear, some distinctive kind of mark to, make them visible in the population. This was actually applied as well to Saracens, or the Muslims, in medieval Europe. And so Jews and Muslims were regarded as very similar, as religious others that were both internal and external to Latin Christendom.
Thank you. You took my what I thought was a silly question. You turned it into a brilliant answer. Thank you for that.
Well,
Uh,
there's always, like, great stories in history, so there aren't dumb questions. They just lead to, kind of learning more about,
yeah, if
about
if if the teacher's you, yeah,
well,
that's true. I mean, it's really crazy though that you actually should not be able to imagine a West without the Muslim influence, but it's just completely gone.
yeah, that's right. I mean, and I think history is so important because our claims around identity, and the way in which we talk about political rights and citizenship has a lot to do with um, making a claim on having a history. And so to erase and eradicate, Muslim history in Europe is designed to create an impression and an understanding that Muslims are foreign, are strangers who don't belong in Europe, and as a result, they don't have a legitimate claim on political citizenship and on political rights in European polities. And that if they exist, they must do so only in a subordinate position, contingent upon their acceptance of, you know, other religious values or secularism or whatever it is that they decide as a policy to use as the boundary to mark the difference between those who are included and those who are excluded in political society and in political rights. And nationalism has only worsened the situation because it has made even increasing specification um, you know, and lines of difference in where political boundaries and political rights can, be drawn. But I think that that is epiphenomenal in some ways. It's very real and very important. Obviously, nation states exist; they have for hundreds of years. There's an whole architecture of state institutions, of ideology, of nationalism, of it's been inculcated as a result of Europe's particular formation of political society to be absolutely crucial and important. But I think you see and can see that without an understanding of Islamophobia, it's very hard to understand contemporary politics in Europe because what's holding together these societies in some ways is really some kind of inimical relationship to the Muslim as an interloper, a social problem, a political problem, um, that has to be resolved. There's every kind of and then it also scrambles what we think of as the traditional left and right. Right, like, the one thing is that that has fallen apart, where it's hard, to really kind of distinguish what constitutes, right conservative politics and what is left liberal or, further left. Like, these sometimes collapse as distinctions that used to seem stable, say, during the 1960s and 70s, right? Um, Part of it, of course, is the undermining through neoliberalism that, of course, has turned a lot of like what we would have thought of as liberals into, very kind of like identitarian right wing, kind of and undermining, workers sorts of movements where class division was more apparent to people. Now you have like redrawing of these boundaries, where the immigrant, the refugee, the cultural other is the problem, and it's not really a class question, even though, of course, most of the people who come, into Europe in those categories, end up inhabiting an underclass, I mean, and are laboring, groups in a class society. But this is, occluded from us because we've reformed these boundaries around nation, national identity, ethnic identity, linguistic and racial identity, and on religious identity, in some meaningful sort of way. So I think it's not really possible to understand the project of Europe now. And I think this is why the right wing is actually more clarifying in giving us a sense of what's really at stake, because they are the ones who, even though they may be ultra nationalists, extreme nationalists, they are extremely, wedded to a concept of the West and Western culture and civilization as the ultimate kind of legitimation of the boundary of difference against the Muslim. And like that's what organizes their politics. It would really organizes their political formation is can't really be understood without seeing that an organizing, if not the organizing principle, is Islamophobia.
Yeah, I think it's also why it can go this fast in the West, that you can get these reactions, get people organized so fast against Muslims, because it is rooted in history. It is rooted in the conception of the West, as you aptly described. Uh, by the way, I can hear. I know that you have a cold, or you just had a
Yeah,
cold,
my voice
and
is going
I
a
can
bit.
hear that your voice is is at its boundary. So please drink some water if you can.
Yeah, and maybe I should have one of these, like, throat drops or something, and
Yeah,
you uh, explain something that you're interested in, and give me a moment
yeah,
to get ready.
yeah, yeah. Of course, that's fine. Can you listen at the same time?
Mm.
Then I can continue because like I think I think we can continue from the same thread about modern day where the boundaries of left and right sort of shift or disappear. And it's like Islamophobia is a great example of that, actually. And I've personally seen that a lot, especially in the case of people who are supposedly pro Palestine, especially on the left. Most people on the left would say they are, I guess. Um, I've seen so many instances where these people would say they support Palestine, but refrain from supporting the resistance, uh, especially because it's led by Hamas, and because Hamas, in their mind, is a what did that person say? A reactionary, totalitarian uh, party, whatever organization. Uh, what do you think? Like, how much how much of it is Islamophobia that people refrain from supporting the resistance on the ground? The resistance against genocide, by the way. I mean, it's not just some random thing. It is resistance against active genocide that they are supposedly saying they're against. I don't know if it might have been a convoluted question, but it's yeah. I mean,
No,
it's
it's a great point. It's a great question and a really important observation that, like in the 1960s, just to clarify whether the fact that it's an Islamic resistance movement is relevant, as opposed to just a resistance movement.
yeah. I mean, we could
I mean, there
also
are.
sorry, just to jump in there as well. Like you are a leftist, right? You come from the Marxist tradition as well. So when someone like this, like someone a so-called leftist calls Hamas reactionary, what do they mean? For example, if we can maybe start from there.
Well, what do they mean? They mean perhaps a few things. One, because it's a religiously oriented movement, it can't be seen as progressive because secularism is a foundational principle for Western Marxists in particular, but also, even the way it was adopted, especially if we think of during the Cold War, that there were a lot of, the United States supported like religious movements as a counterweight to secular leftist, and even if they weren't secular, just any leftist movement, they raised the fears that communism, socialism, these were atheistic ideologies, that the left was inherently a secular project that was hostile and inimical to religion. And in some ways, that was the tradition, and that was something that developed very much out of um, kind of European experience, in particular the reactionary forces of the church that opposed in the 18th and 19th centuries, so often opposed workers' movements for liberation, progressive movements for freedoms, supported, monarchic, political institutions as necessary because of its traditional support for the church and protection of the church. And so there was clearly a historical experience that liberatory, movements had to fight against the embedded institution of the church and of the clerical class. And so much of the political vocabulary, the ideological kind of organization, and the understanding of materialism and secularism, in the Marxist tradition comes from European experience in, early modern and modern, society. So it's not, you know, uh, it's not, surprising in some ways that if you globalize that approach and experience from the basis of European, historical experience and theories that were developed, uh, through it, that you would then think that all religion is a reactionary kind of force. It has, of course, in Eastern societies often been that as well. One cannot, deny that there are many cases where they were aligned with anti-democratic sort of forces. But there is a different history and there's a different historical experience. And the ways in which a kind of leftist tradition and the ways in which liberation, politics and anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, movements and organizing took place in what we call today the global south, or used to be called, the third world, or in the colonized world, or of Asia and Africa. Um, that religion played a major role in many cases as a progressive force. I just concluded an interview with historian and political Green Party political, candidate running for governor, Butch Ware, Professor Butch Ware, who is a scholar of West African Islam, and in his first book about, basically West African religious culture and Quran study, he actually, talks extensively about the anti-slavery and anti-colonial movements of um, Muslim religious scholars, and above all, the Sufi orders of West Africa, the Tijaniya, the Qadiriya, the Murids of Ahmadu Bamba. These were the most important social forces for resisting colonialism and for ending slavery and enslavement in West Africa. So there are different histories and different experiences, and to draw this kind of blanket conclusion that religion must always be anti-progressive and reactionary is not to look, actually, as a Marxist should, at the objective conditions. If a movement of resistance bases itself around connecting itself with religious identity and spirituality and faith as part of the resources it draws upon for resisting settler colonialism, occupation, war, ethnic cleansing, oppression, and genocide, it's very difficult to characterize it as reactionary. I mean, maybe it has social policies and moral codes that in the liberal West are regarded as, you know, unprogressive and so on. But globally speaking, its objective role is confronting imperialism and settler colonialism. And that is not a reactionary movement. That is the basis for, a progressive, liberation of a people. So I get very frustrated by this kind of narrow approach that simply assumes that if you're kind of religiously oriented, you must be, um, you know, uh, uh, reactionary, unprogressive, maybe stupid, because you don't understand, science and all these things. It's just so demeaning, and it also is just foolish because, um, and I was thinking about this, and I always think about this. I think about this really all the time. Um, which is, how could the Palestinian people, our brothers and sisters, survive this genocide if they didn't have their faith? I don't see any way they could continue to resist. They show us, they tell us, they inspire us. And the real and exact meaning of the word inspire, they give spirit. They communicate from their spiritual strength, they give us spirit. Because, one thing I think we were going to sort of chat a little, just how we're doing and what does it feel like during this time. And I have to say, I'm at a low ebb, these days because of all the betrayals. You get a little bit of a ceasefire and you have some hope that maybe there will be a transformation of these conditions, and that all the political work that's been taking place in the West in solidarity and support of the heroic resistance of the Palestinians may finally be having some consequence in the policies of the West, that they have to accept some kind of new political reality, you know, and hold Israel accountable or put some kind of restraint upon them. And, these are undermined by total impunity for breaking every norm, every law, every principle, with no, kind of real constraint being exercised politically. And of course, I think about that situation, and I shouldn't feel um, depressed because of expectations. Why should I have any expectations, given the history that I actually study? This is hardwired in some ways in the historical, experience. And if European political society doesn't consciously try and exorcise those demons of its past in a profound and direct and reparative way, of course it's going to continue to express, sympathy with genocide, because genocide in some ways is a constitutive history of the creation and construction of Europe. Given the history that we were just speaking about and discussing, it is no accident that the entire political elite, not the people necessarily, but the entire political elite and the assumptions upon which they operate, indicate that they have total support for the Zionist project, because it is a settler colonial project, because it is a genocidal project of the elimination of the other, and in particular the Muslim other. I know that there are Palestinian Christians, our brothers and sisters, and so on, but it's the same way that the Sikh man was an object of Islamophobic violence after 9/11 because they were associated with Muslims. They were mistaken for Muslims. Palestinian Christians are just rolled up into the Islamophobia of the and that's why I don't even really think anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism is the best way. I do believe there are specific features to anti-Palestinian racism that need to be understood, studied, and kind of valued, that Palestinians have rights as Palestinians, as people, and that they are suffering some unique components in this moment of history of racism. But I think the overwhelming kind of atmosphere and set of conditions under which some of these specific anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian forms of racism can exist is because they draw from the broader sea of Islamophobia that has historically worked its way, and that Muslimness is a broader category than Muslims themselves. It is those who are associated with what Islam may be, politically, culturally, socially, in the Western or in the racial imagination, as an enemy, as inimical to, as a threat to the system of the current social and political order. That's what's revolutionary about Islam and Muslims, not because Islam and Muslims are always themselves revolutionary and progressive and all of that, but as a challenge to a world order that has been predicated upon colonial racism, genocide, and capitalist exploitation. There is a way in which the Muslim and Islam doesn't fit in easily into the system, and still represents some space of resistance to that. And so that's why I find it so just unfortunate and discouraging to see our comrades, uh, taking this kind of very simplistic sort of perspective and simply denying. Actually, it's an easy way out, because they don't actually have to make commitments to supporting the anti-colonial resistance in a full, direct, and public way, because they can say, well, these are regressive forces. You have to be very careful. We shouldn't. No, no. And, so who are they supporting? Uh, you know, some imagined, people from the PFLP, like, and I love the PFLP. Like, okay, I'm going to do a podcast soon on the new historical documents collection published by Iskra Books, like we did on the historical documents collection on the PLO. They've just published this. It's a wonderful collection. We, admire our anti-imperialist colleagues, their wonderful analysis. This is a tendency that I absolutely affirm within Palestinian society as relevant to global resistance. But let's not exaggerate. The resistance that's taking place is happening by, people who demand that we affirm and recognize their faith as central in some way to their capacity for resistance. If we can't appreciate and recognize that, I don't see us being successful,
Yeah.
for liberating ourselves, in the future.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. It's just so this honest, or I don't know what it is exactly, but it just doesn't work. It won't work. That's the If you want to be against genocide, you have to accept the people who are actually putting their lives on the line and just learn from them, simply, more or less. And I would like to shout out about um, you had, I think you had 2 episodes with Brett O'Shea from Rev Left about Marxism and spirituality.
That's right.
I think they were both great, and people should definitely check them out if they have questions about how would Marxism and spirituality or religion work together or not. All those questions, there are many answers to those in both of those episodes, and they should definitely check them out.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I don't want to say that there's answers. There's, steps towards trying to really think about these things. Everyone, will have to come to resolving, these. I'm not saying anybody needs to have religion. Look, if you're happy with the way you are, you don't need it to help you interpret the world, um, to make sense of it. You have other ways of finding fulfillment and meaning. That's great. No one's saying you have to have this or that. No one wants to legislate for you, but I also don't want to be demeaned and denigrated
Yeah,
for still wanting to preserve something that is, important and good in, our societies and cultures. And, if those conversations give people more insight to feel relaxed and tolerant about forms of difference in a broad coalition of those who want to struggle against imperialism and capitalism together, then that's beneficial,
yeah,
because that's what we're going to need no matter what. No
exactly.
matter what, we're still going to have to be comrades, and we're going to have to find ways to value one another by uh, recognizing what's most significant and important that we can collectively stand together on, and appreciate the differences as part of what makes it possible to have a broad, rich, human kind of collectivity, uh, with variance and difference, um, in order to really be who we are and who we want to be together. So that will look a little bit differently for everyone, but um, I really enjoyed those conversations because it was so uh, unfamiliar for me. And this is one of the reasons why it was wonderful to have Brett as a co host for many years on Guerrilla History, and to continue to have a great relationship with him, is to discover that here was somebody whose leftist orientation and analysis I completely respected, but who also, saw some role and value for inner spiritual life, as important, and didn't just dismiss religion as a, opiate of the masses, and reactionary, useless, and perhaps uh, inimical kind of force. So I really enjoyed those conversations, because it's so rare that you actually have space to talk as people who are committed to justice and equality and the end of capitalism and imperialism, and also feel that the enriching kind of experience of spirit and faith is going to be important for a future that they envision, that they want to be, they want their, I don't see it as anything that I would ever want to transcend. Why would I want to transcend my religious faith? What I would hope is that I may experience and see new things when, the world becomes more just and more equal. Perhaps it will create the conditions in which the spirit can be elevated in new and wonderful sort of ways. In fact, actually, I think that's what Marx was really saying, that institutional religion he could see as a problem in the societies he was dealing with. But, in just the same way that he said philosophy has been the history of this kind of really bankrupt tradition. Doesn't mean it didn't have a lot of useful and there weren't a lot of incredibly intelligent people, but in fact, actually, there would be an end of philosophy as it was understood and practiced in, you know, in the Western capitalist tradition. It didn't mean that he didn't think people would stop thinking seriously about the meaning of life and questions and all that, but it would exist as a very different kind of experience that would be unique and very separate from the traditional framing of questions and problems in philosophical inquiry, the way it had been constituted and traditionally undertaken, you know, in the study of philosophy. Well, likewise, I think the matters of spirit, he also envisioned that there would be a kind of sense of community, connection, of emotional and of really being able to be a human, and that would take a different form than perhaps we understood the way spirituality and religion was talked about. It would be a new kind of experience of fulfilling that human potential. So that's, to my mind, that's what would be wonderful to actually achieve and to experience, in a future free and classless society.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
I mean, like, you sort of situated Latin Christendom as the West, or as the maybe the colonial capitalist West, if we can call it that, the imperialist West. So, and Islamophobia was sort of foundational, as I think as people can understand now, it was foundational for this West, for this imperial West. So, being anti-imperialist should also mean then you are an anti-Islamophobia person, right? Does that make sense?
Well, absolutely. I think you cannot, it is to me a form of racism. And I don't think you can really be a progressive if you don't combat all forms of racism. Um, and what you have to do is you have to understand that racism is not just the scientific or biological racism that was a construct of forms of difference, in kind of, phenotype, morphology, fake biology, skin, color, etc., that was invented essentially as an intellectual project of the colonial order in modern, modernity. That's what it is. So that's a construct. It doesn't mean that there weren't other forms of racial distinction, of what we would think of the concept of race as a much more elastic form of inclusion and exclusion on various bases. And you have to see that in the long history of what we could think of racism, of racial regimes, um, that religion has a place, religious division, religious distinction. Societies like the ones we were talking about in the pre-modern Mediterranean world were often organized around religious identity as the basis of difference. Um, those transform and metamorphose over time into, cultural and almost racial in the more modern sense, like with these blood purity laws, and so on. And the relationship between ethnic difference, ethnicity, and race is also a mobile kind of boundary. There's not just some clear cut differences between these things. And over the long history of forms of exclusion and the way in which they were part of the reproduction of a form of political economy, of a mode of, organizing labor and society and so on for the benefit of, the privileged elites, in different ways and in different forms over time and over history, is that also tracks with what we could think of as the long and various history of racism, right? So Islamophobia is, you know, uh, like anti-Semitism, and like other forms of prejudice. But what's, I think, interesting about them is that they're both religio-racial or religio, ethnic kind of constructs, that move across this boundary and help us illuminate that there is a longer history to racism to really consider and think about. Um, in the way that it's expressed and organized itself. That as a result, it has to be recognized as a form of racism, and people cannot be confused that just because it is also a religious identity to be a Muslim, that there isn't a racialized kind of form of the way it operates in the logics of, Western capitalist, imperialist, colonialist, forms of distinction and forms of knowledge and perception. So I just really don't see um, how you could have a kind of comprehensive vision for uh, liberation and you know um, uh, an end to capitalism if you don't take into account all the forms of racism that are operating and that are constituting themselves, in this kind of racial capitalism that we're living in and living with, in the world that's been created by racial capitalism.
So how do we fight it?
Oh boy, how do we fight it? Well, I think one first kind of principle for me is that having this kind of analysis allows you to see the connections of solidarity so that you don't divide struggles, on the basis of mere identity politics, right? I mean, that's, been dangerous for the left, has undermined a kind of solidarity and has occluded class kind of elements. And if we understand Islamophobia, anti Semitism as species of racism that have much that they share, much that distinguishes themselves, but are part of the processes of settler colonial societies in racial capitalism, then we are able to forge, it seems to me, a more comprehensive and solidaristic movement of resistance across those boundaries where these struggles are not separable. They are part of a collective liberation against a unifying kind of system of oppression that we are all victims of. And that helps clarify what our task ahead is and helps eliminate some of the boundaries that we've and walls we've erected between our struggles. Um, so I think that's one way to fight it, is to recognize that we have to equally be concerned with indigenous, the oppression of indigenous peoples in settler colonial societies everywhere. We have to be concerned with anti-Black racism and the particular histories of genocide and enslavement that have perpetuated a certain racial regime, particularly in, kind of Western societies where these populations have become and been historically and enslaved, and then future, after, manumission, has still been a kind of underclass in a racial regime. One of the problems that I see is, a lot of people who are very concerned about, Palestinians suffering under, the Zionist entity and settler colonialism, who are of Muslim background and immigrants to the West. they don't connect those struggles with what's happening in their own communities and their own societies where there's racism against, say in the United States, against Latinos and Mexicans, where there's a border regime and a settler colonial kind of like protection of against refugees and immigrants. And, they don't want to be associated with, the black underclass because they're aspirational and they're attempting to, you know, develop a higher class position and privileges within American society. And so they want to talk about Palestine as if it's some unique kind of question or problem outside of this larger
Yeah.
analysis. And that undermines solidarity that is absolutely needed. It makes solidarity a transactional, kind of affair where, well, okay, we recognize we really need your help so that we can protest against the genocide that's taking place, but we're not necessarily committed to a vision of liberation that ends racism in our own society. Because we feel we may benefit if only there wasn't this Islamophobia problem, we could, kind of advance within these societies. So I think that's a very important realization, and it's more than an intellectual realization. It is also a commitment to a practice of solidarity. Solidarity isn't by words and just ideas, it is getting involved in your own communities, in struggles with people, who may be different. You must do these kinds of civic, actions to actually forge. Um, these sorts of meaningful political communities that can resist. So that has to come from these realizations and this kind of analysis. But really, again, I feel that it is much more a matter of attitude, of action, of disposition, really of spirit and of values. Like if you value the humanity of others, then you have a chance to actually work, effectively together with them. You have to kind of um, you know, really spiritually be in touch with the true essential humanity of us all, the divine spark that is in everyone. You have to really feel that so that it goes beyond instrumental, transactional, or positional tactical relations into a genuine commitment for human liberation.
Thank you. I think that was a great finisher, I'd say. We've been at it for 1.5 hours. Uh,
It goes by so fast. It's always a pleasure. If it wasn't for, my voice probably telling you that I'm getting towards the end of my capacities, I would just say that, it's always inspiring and these are wonderful, provocations, and you've made me think about things like having the opportunity to articulate some things, and with your good questions and suggestions, and always, I feel coming out of it that I have a renewed understanding and a renewed commitment. So I really enjoy this,
Thank you so
and
much.
thank you so
It's
much for the
the pleasure is
invitation.
all mine, and you're always welcome back. Um, yeah, thank you very much,
Thank you.
and thank you everyone for listening. Go check out Adnan's own show on YouTube. Um, Also, Guerrilla History. He's doing a double duty. Very busy person. Also, he's also in many other podcasts as a guest. So wherever you find him, uh, catch him. You'll learn something. Thank you very much. See you
Thank
soon.
you. Appreciate it.